The demographic and economic expansion of 13th century Silesia was fundamentally driven by the deliberate policies of the Piast dynasty. Following the Mongol invasions of 1241, which left the region severely depopulated and its infrastructure decimated, the Silesian dukes recognized the urgent necessity of integrating their territories into the broader European commercial network. They initiated a series of systematic invitations to foreign merchants, artisans, and financiers to settle in emerging urban centers like Breslau. While many of these settlers arrived from Germanic lands, the dukes specifically targeted Jewish communities due to their unique status as a mobile, non-feudal class capable of providing essential administrative and financial services. These invitations were formalized through legal charters that granted the Jewish community a distinct and protected status within the medieval social hierarchy. By providing personal security and the right to practice their own laws, the dukes bypassed the restrictions of local feudal customs that prioritized land ownership over liquid wealth. This was a strategic calculation. The Piast rulers required an urban merchant class that could facilitate long-distance trade without the constraints of local agrarian obligations. Jewish settlers brought established connections to trade routes extending toward the Baltic and the Levant, effectively transforming Breslau from a regional administrative outpost into a vital hub of international exchange. Furthermore, the introduction of Jewish capital was essential for the transition of the Silesian economy from a barter system to a monetized market. The Piast dukes were the primary beneficiaries of this shift, as they claimed direct jurisdiction over the Jewish population, categorizing them as servants of the treasury. This legal framework ensured that the taxes and fees generated by Jewish commercial activity flowed directly into the ducal coffers, independent of the influence of the local nobility or the clergy. The settlement in Breslau was therefore not a random migration, but a structural necessity for a kingdom seeking to consolidate its fiscal power. By the mid-13th century, the presence of these merchants had become the cornerstone of the city's burgeoning marketplace, providing the liquid assets required to fund the construction of civic buildings, fortifications, and the expansion of the duke's administrative reach. This period of early settlement established a framework of mutual utility where the safety of the community was inextricably linked to their continued contribution to the duke's financial stability. The rapid ascent of Breslau during the High Middle Ages was a direct consequence of its positioning at the crossing of Europe's most significant arterial trade routes. The city sat at the junction of the Via Regia, an east-west corridor spanning from the Iberian Peninsula to the Russian principalities, and the Amber Road, which facilitated the movement of goods between the Baltic Sea and the Mediterranean world. This geographic convergence transformed the city into a mandatory waypoint for transcontinental commerce. For the Jewish merchant class, this location provided a strategic platform to leverage their existing international connections, linking the raw material markets of the northern coast with the sophisticated manufacturing centers of the Byzantine Empire and the Italian city-states. Logistically, the Oder River provided the necessary infrastructure for bulk transport, allowing for the efficient movement of heavy commodities that were otherwise difficult to move overland. While the surrounding feudal territories remained largely insular and focused on localized subsistence, Breslau's Jewish residents operated within a broader continental framework. They facilitated the export of local resources, such as Silesian timber, lead, or unsalted fish, in exchange for high-value imports, including silk, spices, and precious metals from the East. This trade was not merely a matter of moving physical goods. It required a sophisticated understanding of varying regional weights, measures, and coinage systems, a specialized knowledge set that the Jewish community maintained through their ties to other major commercial centers like Prague, Krakow, and Constantinople. The role of Breslau as a pivot point between the Baltic and Byzantium also necessitated the development of advanced storage and security protocols. The city's markets became specialized clearinghouses where bulk shipments were broken down for redistribution into the smaller markets of Central Europe. Jewish entrepreneurs were central to this process. managing the complex logistics of warehousing and protecting inventory during the lengthy intervals between seasonal trade fairs. By coordinating the arrival of caravans and river barges, these merchants ensured a consistent supply of capital and goods, which in turn attracted further investment from across the Holy Roman Empire. This sustained economic activity solidified Breslau's status as the primary commercial gateway of Silesia, making the city's prosperity inseparable from the global networks managed by its Jewish inhabitants. The legal foundation for Jewish life in medieval Silesia was anchored in the Statute of Kalish, a seminal document issued by Bolesław the Pious in 1264. Although originally drafted for Greater Poland, its provisions were rapidly adopted by the Silesian dukes to provide a standardized regulatory environment for the Jewish inhabitants of Breslau. This charter was not a grant of human rights in the modern sense, but rather a sophisticated commercial contract designed to define the Jewish population as a protected and productive asset of the state. By articulating specific protections for life, property, and religious practice, the statute transformed the community from an informal group of residents into a recognized legal estate with a direct relationship to the sovereign. Central to this legal architecture was the principle of judicial autonomy. The statute mandated that legal disputes involving Jewish individuals be settled within their own communal courts, or, in more serious matters, before the duke or his appointed representative. This effectively insulated the community from the jurisdiction of municipal courts and ecclesiastical authorities, who often harbored competing economic or theological interests. Furthermore, the charter established rigorous evidentiary standards for criminal accusations. For instance, a Christian accusing a Jewish person of a crime was required to produce both Christian and Jewish witnesses to corroborate the claim. This provision was a critical safeguard against the arbitrary litigation and false testimonies that frequently plagued minority populations in feudal Europe. Economic security was also codified through precise regulations regarding trade and credit. The statute legalized the lending of money at interest, a practice generally prohibited to the Christian laity under the Church's usury laws, and provided the duke's enforcement power to ensure the repayment of debts. In exchange for these commercial privileges, the Jewish community paid substantial direct taxes to the crown. This arrangement established a cycle of fiscal dependency. The community required the duke's legal protection to conduct business, and the duke required the community's revenue to maintain his political and military standing. This contract effectively prioritized the economic utility of the Jewish residents over the growing social and religious pressures from the local clergy, creating a period of legal stability that allowed the community to invest in permanent institutions such as synagogues and educational centers. However, this entire system rested on the integrity of the sovereign, meaning that any erosion of ducal power would simultaneously undermine the very legal pillars that ensured Jewish survival. By the late 13th century, the Jewish settlement in Breslau had transitioned from a transient merchant colony into a permanent urban fixture characterized by sophisticated stone architecture. Centered near the modern-day University District and the banks of the Oder River, the Jewish quarter was not an isolated ghetto, but an integral part of the city's structural core. Unlike the timber-frame dwellings common among the lower classes, the residences of the Jewish elite were constructed from durable stone and brick, signaling both the accumulation of capital and a long-term commitment to the locality. These structures were designed with dual functionality, once serving as high-security private residences while providing the necessary basement space for the storage of trade goods and communal archives. At the heart of this district stood the synagogue, an architectural testament to the community's legal and economic standing. This building functioned as more than a house of worship. It served as the administrative and judicial hub of the Jewish estate. Adjacent to it were the communal bathhouses and schools, which formed the physical infrastructure of a robust intellectual environment. The presence of stone-built libraries and study halls facilitated the growth of Breslau as a major center of rabbinic scholarship in Central Europe. This period saw the production of complex legal commentaries and liturgical texts. As the city's scholars maintained an active correspondence with other intellectual centers in the Rhineland and northern France, the physical permanence of these institutions reflected a belief in the enduring stability of the legal protections provided by the Piast dukes. The literacy rates within this quarter significantly exceeded those of the surrounding Christian population, as the community's religious and commercial activities necessitated a high degree of proficiency in multiple scripts and languages. The use of parchment for the meticulous recording of communal contracts, marriage agreements, and property deeds created a parallel administrative history of the city, often more detailed than the records kept by the municipal government. This concentration of stone-built assets and scholarly output made the Jewish quarter a distinct landscape within Breslau, representing a unique intersection of private wealth and public intellectualism. The transition from temporary dwellings to a city of stone and parchment demonstrated that the Jewish community had become a fundamental pillar of Breslau's urban identity, creating a physical and cultural legacy that would persist until the political upheavals of the 14th century. The administrative classification of the Jewish community as servants of the royal treasury was the defining feature of their political existence in 14th century Breslau. This legal designation created a direct, unmediated relationship between the Duke and the Jewish residents, bypassing the traditional feudal hierarchies that governed the rest of Silesian society. Under this system, the Jewish population was viewed not as a collection of individual citizens, but as a specialized fiscal instrument belonging to the sovereign's private chamber. This status provided a critical buffer for the Piast dukes, who used the community to generate liquid revenue that was entirely independent of the increasingly assertive Christian estates and the local church. In practical terms, this meant that the Jewish community functioned as the Duke's primary source of emergency funding and consistent tax revenue, while the Christian nobility and the rising urban merchant guilds often resisted new levies or tied their financial support to political concessions. The Duke could exercise near absolute authority over the taxation of his Jewish servants. The community paid for the privilege of protection through a variety of specialized fees, including residence taxes, commercial permits, and massive benevolences demanded during times of war or dynastic crisis. This relationship was inherently transactional. The Duke's willingness to enforce the community's safety was a calculated investment intended to preserve a reliable and expandable source of capital. Furthermore, this fiscal status allowed the Duke to utilize the Jewish community to manage the state's debt without devaluing the currency. By granting Jewish lenders the right to collect interest and then heavily taxing those profits, the sovereign effectively used the community as a middleman for wealth redistribution. This created a unique economic dynamic where the Jewish residents were shielded from the hostility of the local guilds by the Duke's personal interest in their productivity. However, being the servants of the treasury was a precarious position, as it linked the survival of the community to the Duke's personal solvency. If the sovereign's debts grew too large to be serviced by tax revenue alone, the temptation to cancel those debts by removing the creditors became a constant threat. This chapter of Breslau's history illustrates that the community's greatest strength, their proximity to the seat of power, was also their most significant strategic vulnerability. The year 1267 marked a decisive shift in the social and religious landscape of Silesia with the convening of the Synod of Breslau. This ecclesiastical assembly was presided over by the papal legate Guido, who sought to implement the restrictive decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council within the Polish and Silesian territories. For the first time, the Church transitioned from general theological disapproval to the enactment of specific, institutionalized measures designed to enforce a permanent social barrier between the Christian majority and the Jewish minority. The primary objective of these canons was the prevention of social and physical integration, which the clergy viewed as a threat to the religious purity of the Christian laity. The most visible and controversial outcome of the 1267 Synod was the mandate for Jews to wear distinctive clothing, specifically a pointed or horned hat. This garment was intended to serve as a permanent visual marker, ensuring that any interaction between a Christian and a Jewish person was immediately recognizable in the public sphere. By imposing this dress code, the Church aimed to dehumanize the community and facilitate the enforcement of other restrictive laws, such as the prohibition of shared meals, joint business ventures outside the marketplace, and the employment of Christian servants in Jewish households. These measures were not merely symbolic, they were administrative tools used to categorize the Jewish population as a separate and inherently inferior legal class. Furthermore, the Synod attempted to restrict the physical movement and residence of the community. The decrees called for the enclosure of the Jewish quarter, suggesting that Jews should live in areas separated from Christians by walls or ditches to prevent uncontrolled interaction. While the pious dukes initially resisted the full implementation of these measures due to their reliance on Jewish economic activity, the Synod established a legal and moral precedent that the local municipal authorities would later exploit. The Church's insistence on segregation created a lingering tension between the secular protection of the duke and the spiritual demands of the clergy. This theological tremor signaled the beginning of a long-term erosion of the community's social status, as the Church successfully framed the presence of the Jews not as a fiscal asset, but as a spiritual and social contamination that required systematic containment. Following the legislative framework established by the Synod, the ecclesiastical authorities in Breslau began a systematic campaign to enforce a physical and social wall of separation between the Christian burghers and the Jewish inhabitants. This initiative moved beyond mere symbolic identification to target the everyday points of contact that facilitated communal integration. The Church viewed the relative social fluidity of the 13th century, where Jewish and Christian neighbors lived in proximity and engaged in shared social rituals, as a primary obstacle to religious orthodoxy. Consequently, new local ordinances were introduced to strictly regulate the domestic and professional boundaries of the Jewish quarter. One of the most effective methods of enforced isolation was the total prohibition on Christian domestic labor within Jewish households. For decades, many Jewish families had employed Christian nurses, cooks, and cleaners, a practice that established deep personal ties between the communities. The clergy moved to sever these links, imposing heavy fines and the threat of excommunication on any Christian who accepted such employment. This was an economic strike as much as a social one. By removing Christian labor from the Jewish quarter, the Church aimed to make Jewish domestic life more difficult and socially invisible. Simultaneously, the bishopric pressured the municipal authorities to prohibit Jewish residents from appearing in public during Christian festivals and Sundays, effectively erasing their presence from the city's civic and religious calendar. The effort to limit contact also extended into the professional and commercial sectors of the city. While the Duke still protected the right of Jews to trade in the marketplace, the Church successfully lobbied for the implementation of separate trading hours and designated stalls, ensuring that Christian and Jewish merchants operated in parallel rather than in tandem. These early efforts at segregation were designed to foster a sense of otherness among the Christian burghers, transforming the Jewish community from neighbors into a separate, alien entity. This period of increasing isolation meant that by the time economic tensions escalated in the 14th century, the social bonds that might have moderated communal violence had already been systematically dismantled by decades of ecclesiastical policy. The wall of separation was not yet a physical structure of brick and mortar, but it had become an impenetrable social reality that left the Jewish community increasingly vulnerable to the whims of the municipal government. The reign of Henrik IV Probus, spanning the final decades of the 13th century, represented the zenith of political stability and legal consolidation for the Jewish community of Breslau. As a ruler who successfully centralized power across much of fragmented Silesia, Henrik IV viewed the Jewish population as an essential component of his administrative statecraft. Under his governance, the community was not merely tolerated, but was integrated into the city's formal municipal structure through a series of reinforced privileges that countered the growing isolationist rhetoric of the Church. The Duke's strong central authority provided a vital check against the local bishopric, on ensuring that the restrictive canons of the 1267 Synod remained largely unenforced in the secular and commercial spheres of the city. This period was characterized by the precise codification of Jewish municipal rights, particularly regarding property ownership and the resolution of civil disputes. Henrik IV confirmed that the Jewish residents held their lands and stone houses in the university district under the same secure tenure as the Christian patricians, protecting them from the arbitrary seizures that were becoming common in other European territories. By maintaining a predictable legal environment, the Duke encouraged the continued influx of Jewish capital, which he utilized to fund his ambitious diplomatic and military campaigns. The community's role as a reliable source of liquid assets allowed the Duke to expand the city's infrastructure and fortifications, further cementing the bond between the sovereign's strategic goals and the community's economic success. Furthermore, Henrik IV Probus actively utilized Jewish administrators and financiers in the management of the ducal mint and the collection of customs duties. This high-level involvement in the state's financial machinery gave the Jewish elite a degree of political leverage that bypassed the traditional guild-dominated city council. The Duke's reliance on these specialists created a period of relative social peace, as the threat of royal intervention deterred the rising merchant guilds from initiating anti-Jewish legislation. The stability of this era allowed for the flourishing of the Breslau rabbinate, which became a recognized authority on matters of commercial law across Central Europe. However, the prosperity of this period was inherently tied to the personal strength and longevity of Henrik IV. His death in 1290 without a direct heir triggered a power vacuum in Silesia, removing the primary barrier between the Jewish community and the increasingly hostile municipal forces that sought to dismantle their protected status. The transition into the early 14th century saw a fundamental shift in the urban power dynamics of Breslau, as the emerging Christian merchant guilds began to challenge the Jewish community's dominance in the financial sector. During the initial stages of the city's growth, Jewish financiers had filled a critical void by providing liquid capital that the feudal economy lacked. However, as the Christian burgher class accumulated its own wealth through the cloth trade and metal exports, they began to view the Jewish monopoly on credit not as a necessary service, but as a barrier to their own expansion. This economic envy was intensified by the fact that Jewish lenders operated under the direct protection of the Duke, exempting them from the restrictive regulations and high membership fees that the guilds imposed on their own members. The guilds utilized their increasing influence within the city council to petition for laws that would undermine the competitive advantages of Jewish merchants. One primary area of contention was the right to trade in raw materials and finished luxury goods, sectors where Jewish families maintained superior international networks. The Christian guilds argued that these activities should be the exclusive domain of those who held municipal citizenship, a status that was systematically denied to Jewish residents despite their long-term habitation in the city. By framing the issue as a matter of civic fairness, the guilds successfully lobbied for new ordinances that restricted Jewish commercial activity to specific days and locations, attempting to relegate them to the fringes of the very marketplace they had helped build. The most volatile point of friction was the control of the local credit market. While the church officially prohibited usury among Christians, many members of the patrician class were beginning to engage in covert lending practices and sought to eliminate their primary competition. These emerging Christian financiers viewed the Jewish community's ability to offer lower interest rates due to their higher volume of capital as a form of economic aggression. In response, the guilds began a campaign of organized litigation, encouraging Christian debtors to challenge the validity of their obligations in municipal courts rather than the Duke's specialized tribunals. This strategy was designed to paralyze Jewish assets in lengthy legal disputes, effectively freezing the community's liquidity. The rising tension between the guilds and the Jewish networks was no longer just a matter of trade competition. It was a structural struggle for the soul of Breslau's economy, where the guilds sought to replace the Duke's servants of the treasury with a municipal financial system controlled entirely by the burgher elite. The early 14th century witnessed a significant radicalization of religious discourse in Breslau, driven primarily by the arrival and rising influence of the Mendicant orders. The Dominicans and Franciscans, unlike the traditional monastic orders that remained sequestered in rural abbeys, established their convents within the urban heart of the city. Their mission was centered on public preaching and the spiritual regulation of the burgeoning burgher class. These friars introduced a new, aggressive form of popular theology that specifically targeted the economic activities of the Jewish community. By moving their pulpits into the public squares and marketplaces, the Mendicants successfully bridged the gap between abstract church doctrine and the daily economic anxieties of the Christian population. The core of this theological offensive was the redefinition of usury from a technical religious transgression into a moral and social plague. While the local bishopric had long grumbled about Jewish lending, the Mendicant preachers framed the collection of interest as a direct assault on the Christian community's welfare. They utilized highly emotional and inflammatory rhetoric to characterize Jewish financiers as parasites who lived off the labor of the poor. This preaching was strategically timed to coincide with market days, ensuring maximum impact on the very merchants and debtors who were most likely to feel the pressure of financial obligations. By moralizing debt, the friars provided a spiritual justification for the economic envy already felt by the guilds, transforming a commercial rivalry into a holy crusade for social justice. Furthermore, the Mendicant orders were instrumental in the proliferation of new, localized, anti-Jewish myths. They often used their sermons to spread rumors regarding the desecration of Christian symbols, or the supposed ritual dangers inherent in physical contact with non-Christians. These narratives were designed to instill a sense of spiritual dread among the laity, making the physical wall of separation discussed in previous years appear not only as a legal necessity, but as a religious emergency. The friars also acted as advisors to the city council, pushing for the implementation of the most restrictive elements of canon law that the pious dukes had previously ignored. This alliance between the urban preachers and the municipal government created a powerful political bloc that bypassed royal authority. The theological shift, led by the Dominicans and Franciscans, effectively dismantled the intellectual and social tolerance of the previous century, replacing it with a climate of persistent hostility, where the presence of the Jewish community was increasingly viewed as an affront to both the city's economy and its soul. The transition into the mid-14th century brought a definitive end to the political unity that had characterized the era of Henrik IV Probus. Silesia underwent a process of extreme territorial fragmentation, as the once cohesive duchy was partitioned into numerous smaller competing principalities, ruled by various branches of the Piast dynasty. This political atomization fundamentally altered the security environment for the Jewish community of Breslau. In the previous century, a single powerful duke had served as the sole arbiter of Jewish law and the exclusive recipient of their taxes, creating a clear chain of command and protection. With the division of the land, this centralized shield dissolved, leaving the community to navigate a chaotic landscape of overlapping jurisdictions and weakened sovereigns. This fragmentation led to a significant erosion of the duke's ability to enforce the traditional legal protections guaranteed by the crown. As individual Silesian dukes became poorer and more desperate for local political alliances, they began to cede their exclusive rights over the Jewish population to the rising municipal governments. In Breslau, the city council took advantage of the duke's financial insolvency and political weakness to demand greater control over the city's internal affairs, including the right to tax and regulate the Jewish inhabitants. Without a strong central authority to veto anti-Jewish ordinances, the community was increasingly subjected to the whims of the local burghers, who viewed the Jewish servants of the treasury as an obstacle to their own civic autonomy rather than a protected royal asset. Furthermore, the smaller principalities were frequently at war with one another, creating a state of perpetual instability that disrupted the long-distance trade routes essential for Jewish commerce. The lack of a single powerful protector meant that the Jewish community could no longer rely on a consistent application of the law. A privilege granted by one duke might be ignored or revoked by his successor or a neighboring rival. This political weakness also made the dukes more susceptible to the pressures of the local clergy and the mendicant orders, who pushed for the implementation of restrictive measures that stronger monarchs had previously resisted. The fragmentation of Silesia essentially orphaned the Jewish community, stripping away the high-level diplomatic and military protection that had been the cornerstone of their existence. By 1319, the Jewish residents of Breslau found themselves facing a predatory municipal council without the intervention of a sovereign capable of, or interested in, upholding the traditional contracts of the past. The turn of the 14th century brought a severe economic contraction to Breslau, characterized by a period of local inflation and currency instability. This financial volatility fundamentally altered the relationship between the Silesian nobility and the Jewish credit networks. For decades, the landed aristocracy had utilized Jewish loans to fund their extravagant lifestyles, administrative expenses, and military equipment. However, the economic downturn of 1300 meant that the agricultural yields of the noble estates were no longer sufficient to service the high interest rates of these accumulated debts. What had once been a convenient financial tool became an existential burden, transforming the nobility's reliance on Jewish capital from a source of stability into a primary driver of political resentment. This crisis was exacerbated by the devaluation of local coinage, which increased the real value of debts held in silver, as the nobility found themselves increasingly insolvent. When they began to frame their financial failures, not as a result of poor estate management, but as a consequence of Jewish exploitation. The political discourse in Breslau shifted toward the concept of unbearable usury, providing the aristocracy with a moral justification to seek the cancellation of their legal obligations. Rather than repaying the principal, the debtor class began to use their influence within the provincial assemblies to demand moratoriums on debt collection. This resentment was particularly dangerous because it aligned the interests of the indebted knights with those of the anti-Jewish municipal guilds and the radical mendicant preachers. The debt crisis also undermined the duke's role as the community's protector. Traditionally, the sovereign benefited from Jewish lending through the taxation of interest income. However, as the nobility's ability to pay collapsed, the duke faced a choice between upholding the law or appeasing his most powerful subjects. The insolvency of the knightly class meant that the Jewish community was holding vast amounts of paper wealth that could not be liquidated without royal intervention. When that intervention failed to materialize, the community's assets were effectively frozen. This period demonstrated that when the ruling class becomes the primary debtor, the rule of law is often the first casualty. By 1300, the Jewish community of Breslau was no longer viewed as a vital engine of the economy, but as a predatory creditor class, whose removal would provide an immediate and effortless solution to the nobility's financial ruin. The early decades of the 14th century were defined by an aggressive expansion of civic autonomy as the Breslau City Council, known as the Rat, began to systematically dismantle the duke's exclusive jurisdiction over the Jewish community. This period marked the transition from a ducal-centered administration to a municipal one, where the urban patrician class sought to exercise direct control over all residents within the city walls. The city council viewed the dukes' servants of the treasury as a legal anomaly that interfered with their vision of a self-governing commune. By leveraging the sovereign's increasing financial dependence on the city's tax base, the councilors successfully negotiated for the right to supervise Jewish legal and commercial affairs, a prerogative previously reserved for the crown. A primary tool in this takeover was the acquisition of the right to issue municipal ordinances that bypassed royal charters. The city council began to implement local regulations that restricted where Jewish residents could conduct business and under what conditions they could interact with the Christian guilds. While the duke's earlier decrees focused on the protection of the community to ensure fiscal productivity, the municipal laws were designed to prioritize the economic interests of the burghers. The council successfully lobbied to have Jewish court cases moved from the Duke's specialized palace tribunals to the municipal town hall, where the judges were the very merchants who competed with Jewish lenders. This shift effectively ended the impartial legal standing the community had enjoyed under the Piast dynasty. The municipal authorities also targeted the Duke's monopoly on Jewish taxation. As the sovereign's power fragmented, the city council began to demand a share of the protection money paid by the Jewish quarter, eventually imposing its own layer of civic taxes. This double taxation placed an unprecedented strain on the community's resources, further reducing their ability to manage the risks associated with large-scale lending. The council also asserted its authority over the physical infrastructure of the Jewish district, claiming the right to regulate building permits and the maintenance of the city walls adjacent to Jewish properties. By 1315, the political center of gravity had shifted. The Jewish residents were no longer primarily under the protection of a distant and weakened duke, but were instead under the immediate and often hostile supervision of the local municipal elite. This rise of municipal power created a dangerous new dynamic where the city's leaders possessed the authority to regulate the Jewish community without the traditional royal obligation to ensure their survival. The mid-14th century saw the introduction of a new and volatile element into the social fabric of Breslau: the filtration of irrational accusations and blood libels from neighboring Germanic and Bohemian territories. These narratives, which had been circulating in the Rhineland and Bavaria for decades, began to penetrate Silesian consciousness through the movement of itinerant preachers and regional trade networks. Unlike previous grievances, which were largely anchored in economic competition or legal status, these rumors were based on fabricated claims of ritual crimes. These included the supposed desecration of the consecrated host and the allegation that Jewish communities required Christian blood for religious ceremonies. These myths were designed to provoke a visceral, emotional response from the Christian laity, transforming the Jewish resident from a fiscal neighbor into a supernatural threat. The mechanism of this filtration was largely institutional. While the educated elite and higher levels of the secular administration often recognized these claims as fraudulent, the municipal authorities and local clergy frequently allowed them to spread unchecked. In the marketplaces of Breslau, stories of miraculous events in distant cities, where the host allegedly bled after being pierced by a Jewish person, were recounted as verified historical facts. This created a climate of persistent suspicion, where every unexplained death or missing child could potentially be blamed on the Jewish quarter. By providing a common enemy, these rumors helped to unify the disparate social groups of Breslau: the struggling artisans, the indebted knights, and the radical friars, under a single banner of religious defense. These accusations served a specific political purpose. They provided a moral justification for the violation of the legal protections guaranteed by the Duke. If the Jewish community was framed as a group actively conspiring against the spiritual and physical well-being of the Christian population, then the traditional contract of protection was considered null and void. The filtration of these myths into the local consciousness meant that by 1315, any minor incident could serve as a flashpoint for large-scale violence. The rumors essentially dehumanized the community, preparing the public to accept the idea of total expulsion as a necessary act of communal cleansing. This psychological shift was a prerequisite for the events of 1319, as it dismantled the remaining social inhibitions against attacking a population that had been a cornerstone of the city's life for over a century. The host desecration and blood libel myths effectively replaced the rational, legalistic relationship between the city and its Jews with a state of permanent, religiously motivated hysteria. The events of 1312 functioned as a violent litmus test for the stability of the legal and protective framework that had governed Breslau for generations. This year was marked by a series of localized but intense riots that erupted within the urban center, specifically targeting Jewish commercial properties and residences. Unlike the generalized tensions of previous decades, these disturbances were characterized by an organized effort to challenge the physical security of the Jewish quarter. The immediate triggers were often minor disputes over debt collection or marketplace regulations, but the rapid escalation of these incidents into mob violence indicated a profound breakdown in the city's social order. These riots provided a critical observation point for both the municipal authorities and the Jewish community to gauge the actual strength of the Duke's commitment to his traditional role as protector. During the height of the 1312 disturbances, the military response from the ducal administration was conspicuously delayed and ultimately insufficient. While the reigning Duke Breslau III the Generous maintained the legal rhetoric of Jewish protection, his actual ability to deploy force within the city walls was hampered by his ongoing conflicts with neighboring Silesian cousins and his massive personal debts to the Breslau City Council. The lack of a swift, decisive intervention by the sovereign's guards emboldened the rioters and signaled that the Duke was no longer willing or able to risk political capital or military resources to defend his servants of the treasury. This hesitation transformed the legal guarantees of the past into hollow promises, effectively granting the municipal government a silent mandate to manage Jewish affairs without fear of royal reprisal. The aftermath of 1312 saw a significant shift in the Jewish community's strategic outlook. Recognizing that the ducal shield was failing, many of the wealthiest families began to quietly liquidate their immovable assets or transfer capital to more secure regions like the Kingdom of Poland. The riots also led to an increase in the cost of protection, as the Duke demanded even higher contributions from the community to fund the very guards who had failed to protect them. Meanwhile, the city council utilized the unrest to argue that the presence of the Jewish community was a primary cause of urban instability, pushing for even greater municipal control over the Jewish district. The 1312 riots proved that the age of reliable royal sanctuary had ended. The community was now existing in a state of precarious exposure, where their survival depended on the tolerance of a hostile local government, rather than the power of a weakened crown. The onset of the Great Famine in 1315 introduced a period of unprecedented systemic shock that destabilized the entire social order of Silesia. Triggered by a series of catastrophic harvest failures and persistent torrential rains across northern Europe, the crisis resulted in a total collapse of the agrarian supply chain. In Breslau, the scarcity of grain led to hyperinflation, with the price of basic staples increasing by over 300% within a single year. This was not a localized event, but a continental disaster that exhausted the emergency reserves of both the peasantry and the urban burghers. As the mortality rate climbed and the city's charitable institutions failed to meet the demand for relief, the desperation of the starving population necessitated the identification of an internal cause for the divine or natural catastrophe. During this period of mass starvation, the search for a domestic scapegoat focused squarely on the Jewish community's role in the grain and credit markets. Although Jewish merchants were subject to the same shortages as their Christian neighbors, their visibility as financiers made them easy targets for accusations of price gouging and hoarding. The municipal authorities, facing potential bread riots from the artisans and laborers, did little to discourage the narrative that Jewish capitalists were profiting from the collective misery. By framing the famine as a consequence of economic exploitation rather than environmental collapse, the city council successfully diverted public anger away from their own inability to secure the food supply. This period marked the transition of the Jewish resident from a fiscal asset into a perceived existential predator during times of scarcity. Furthermore, the Great Famine eroded the last vestiges of the Duke's protective authority. The sovereign's revenue from Jewish taxation plummeted, as the community's capital was tied up in uncollectible debts from a starving nobility and a bankrupt peasantry. With the Duke unable to provide financial or physical security, the Jewish quarter became increasingly isolated. The famine also fueled a resurgence of the radical preaching mentioned in earlier chapters, as the Mendicant orders interpreted the starvation as a divine punishment for the city's continued tolerance of usurers. The psychological impact of the famine was profound. It shattered the thin veneer of urban cooperation and established a precedent where the expulsion of the Jewish community was viewed as a necessary act of communal survival. By 1317, the social climate in Breslau had reached a state of permanent volatility, one where the end of the famine did not bring peace, but rather a focused desire to purge the city of the population blamed for its suffering. The socio-economic tension in Breslau reached a critical threshold during the final stages of the Great Famine, as the abstract search for a cause solidified into specific, state-sanctioned accusations against the Jewish quarter. Central to this hostility was the scapegoat of scarcity narrative, which alleged that Jewish grain merchants and creditors were deliberately manipulating the supply of bread to maximize profits during the crisis. Historically, the Jewish community had indeed played a role in the regional grain trade, utilizing their liquidity to purchase surplus crops in productive years. However, in the context of a total harvest collapse, this legitimate commercial activity was reinterpreted by the municipal authorities and the starving populace as a malicious conspiracy to engineer a famine for financial gain. The city council intensified this atmosphere by initiating aggressive investigations into Jewish warehouses and private cellars. While these searches rarely uncovered the massive hoards of grain described in popular rumors, the very act of the inspections served to validate the public's suspicions. Official municipal proclamations began to imply that the community's international trade networks were being used to spirit away Silesian resources to foreign markets in Bohemia or Poland, leaving the local burghers to perish. This was a significant departure from previous decades, where the community's external connections were praised for bringing luxury goods into the city. Now, those same links were framed as a conduit for treasonous extraction. Furthermore, the accusation of hoarding was applied to the financial sector through the concept of capital scarcity. The indebted Christian nobility and the struggling artisan guilds argued that the Jewish community was hoarding the city's silver, refusing to issue new loans or extend existing ones unless the terms were predatory. This narrative ignored the reality that Jewish liquidity was itself exhausted by the widespread defaults of their debtors. By focusing on the supposed hidden wealth within the Jewish quarter, the municipal government provided a convenient solution to the city's insolvency: the physical seizure of Jewish assets. The scapegoating served a dual purpose. It exonerated the city council for its lack of emergency grain reserves and offered a clear path to debt relief through the eventual confiscation of Jewish property. By 1318, the Jewish resident was no longer viewed as a merchant providing a service, but as a domestic enemy whose presence was directly linked to the empty stomachs of the Christian population. The year 1318 represented a critical transition from the social and theological hostility of the famine years to a direct legislative attack on the economic foundation of the Jewish community in Breslau. The city council, operating with an unprecedented level of autonomy from the weakened Piast dukes, issued a radical financial decree that sought to unilaterally alter the contractual obligations between Christian debtors and Jewish creditors. The core of this ordinance was the arbitrary cancellation of all outstanding interest payments, effectively freezing the income stream upon which the community relied to pay their own protection taxes and communal expenses. This was not a negotiated settlement, but a forced redistribution of wealth designed to provide immediate relief to the indebted patrician class and the struggling artisan guilds. The decree functioned as a de facto partial confiscation of Jewish property. By targeting the interest rather than the principal, the council maintained a thin veneer of legalism, claiming they were merely correcting the moral sin of usury that the Mendicant orders had been denouncing from the pulpits. However, the administrative reality was that the removal of interest made the original loans economically unviable. As the inflation and currency devaluations of the previous decade had already eroded the real value of the principal silver, this legislative move effectively stripped Jewish financiers of their primary tool for managing risk, leaving them with massive portfolios of non-performing loans that were now legally barred from generating revenue. Furthermore, the 1318 decree established a specialized municipal commission to audit all existing debt contracts held within the Jewish quarter. These audits were conducted with a clear bias toward the Christian burghers. Any contract deemed excessive or lacking sufficient Christian witnesses was declared void in its entirety. This process encouraged a wave of opportunistic litigation, as debtors flocked to the town hall to have their obligations erased under the new municipal standards. The Duke, facing his own insolvency and requiring the political support of the city council to maintain his throne, failed to exercise his traditional right of veto over this breach of royal privilege. The financial decree of 1318 proved that the legal contract of the 13th century had been discarded. The Jewish community was no longer a protected fiscal partner of the state, but was instead being treated as a stranded asset to be liquidated for the benefit of the municipal treasury. This act of economic dismantling was the final prerequisite for the physical expulsion that would follow in the coming months. The aftermath of the Great Famine in Breslau provided the local bishopric with the necessary political leverage to move beyond the social segregation of previous decades and demand a total purge of the Jewish population. By 1319, the ecclesiastical leadership had abandoned the cautious legalism of the earlier Piast era, replacing it with a radicalized rhetoric that framed the continued presence of the Jewish community as a spiritual pollutant. The bishop argued that the catastrophic harvest failures and the subsequent mass starvation were not mere natural occurrences, but divine punishments directed at a city that had prioritized secular fiscal utility over religious orthodoxy. This ultimatum forced the reigning duke to choose between his traditional role as a protector and his standing within the Christian community. The bishop's strategy involved the systematic weaponization of the famine's psychological toll on the survivors. In official communications to the ducal court, the church hierarchy asserted that the legal contract of 1264 was an affront to divine law and that the city would remain under a state of spiritual peril as long as infidels were permitted to live in the shadow of the cathedral. This theological pressure was coupled with the threat of interdict, the suspension of all church services and sacraments, which would have effectively paralyzed the social and legal life of the Christian burghers. By linking the community's residents to the city's cosmic safety, the bishopric transformed a matter of state policy into a non-negotiable religious emergency. Furthermore, the bishopric utilized the debt crisis to align the interests of the local nobility with the church's spiritual demands. The clergy offered a moral absolution for the cancellation of debts, while suggesting that the seizure of Jewish assets was not a crime of theft, but a pious act of restitution to the Christian community. This rhetoric provided the indebted knights with a sanctified excuse to support the expulsion, removing the last segment of the elite that had historically benefited from Jewish lending. The bishop's ultimatum also included a demand for the confiscation of the community's stone structures, including the synagogue and the libraries in the university district, to be repurposed for ecclesiastical use. By 1319, the theological shift had reached its logical conclusion. The Jewish resident was no longer viewed as a servant of the treasury, but as an obstacle to the city's reconciliation with the divine. This final administrative and spiritual push left the Duke with no political room to maneuver, making the total removal of the community an inevitability. By the spring of 1319, the traditional model of ducal protection reached a definitive structural failure as the financial interests of the sovereign shifted from long-term tax revenue to immediate asset liquidation. The reigning Duke of Breslau, burdened by the cumulative costs of regional warfare and the collapse of agricultural rents following the famine, faced a level of personal and state insolvency that could no longer be managed through traditional borrowing. In this desperate fiscal climate, the Jewish community underwent a fundamental reevaluation in the eyes of the crown. The Duke realized that the community's static value, represented by their stone residences, synagogue, communal lands, and outstanding debt registries, far exceeded the diminishing returns of their annual protection fees. This shift in the Duke's logic represented the final abandonment of the 1264 contract. Protection had always been a transactional service, Once the community's ability to generate new liquid capital was exhausted by the municipal financial decrees of the previous year, they ceased to be a functioning fiscal buffer. The Duke concluded that the most efficient method to settle his own massive obligations to the city council and the nobility was to permit the total dismantling of the Jewish estate. By allowing the expulsion, the Duke could legally default on his own substantial debts to Jewish lenders while simultaneously claiming a significant portion of the proceeds from the sale of confiscated Jewish properties. This was a move of cold administrative pragmatism. The servants of the treasury were now worth more to the state as a liquidated resource than as living subjects. Furthermore, the Duke utilized the pending expulsion as a diplomatic bargaining chip with the municipal government. In exchange for withdrawing his protection, he secured new credit lines and political concessions from the city council, effectively selling his jurisdictional rights over the Jewish quarter to the burgher elite. This act of betrayal removed the final legal obstacle to the community's removal, as the Duke signed away the charters that had once served as their primary defense. The breakdown of protection was not a result of a sudden loss of royal empathy, but a deliberate policy choice made by a sovereign who prioritized his own political survival over the preservation of a bankrupt and isolated minority. By the early months of 1319, the administrative machinery of the crown had been fully repurposed for the task of expropriation, marking the end of the Piast era of tolerance and the transition to a period of total municipal dominance. The formal termination of Jewish life in medieval Breslau was executed through a public reading of the decree of expulsion in the central town square during the summer of 1319. This administrative act served as the official revocation of the residency rights that had been granted and protected by the Piast dynasty for over half a century. The document, drafted by the city council with the explicit consent of the Duke, declared that the Jewish population was no longer under the protection of the state and was therefore required to vacate the city within a strictly defined time frame. This reading was not a suggestion of relocation, but a total removal of legal standing, transforming the community into stateless individuals without any recourse to the traditional judicial tribunals. The decree prioritized the immediate transfer of immovable assets to the municipal treasury and the local bishopric. It explicitly stated that all stone houses, the synagogue, and the communal cemeteries were to be seized as partial compensation for the city's supposed economic grievances and religious purification. Jewish residents were permitted to carry only a minimal amount of personal property and currency, with the majority of their wealth, on including detailed debt registries and physical collateral, remains behind for systematic redistribution among the Christian burghers. This process was managed by municipal clerks who recorded the inventory of the Jewish quarter to ensure that no capital escaped the city's jurisdiction. The formal reading also served as a signal to the guilds that all previous commercial contracts with Jewish merchants were officially nullified. Following the reading, the physical process of removal was enforced by the municipal guard, who monitored the exits of the city to prevent any return. The expulsion was characterized by a total lack of royal intervention, as the Duke had already departed the city after receiving his share of the confiscated assets. The community was forced to move toward the borders of the Kingdom of Poland, where different legal charters still offered a measure of safety. In Breslau, the departure of the community led to an immediate reconfiguration of the urban landscape. The Jewish quarter was renamed and repurposed, and the physical evidence of their scholarship and commerce was dismantled or integrated into the church's property. This final decree ensured that the contract established in 1264 was not only broken but legally erased from the city's administrative memory. The expulsion of 1319 completed the transition of Breslau into a city governed exclusively by municipal and ecclesiastical interests, marking the end of its first era of international financial significance. The physical dismantling of the Jewish quarter in 1319 was an organized administrative operation that converted decades of accumulated private property into municipal and ecclesiastical capital. This process focused on the permanent seizure of stone-built assets, which represented the most significant concentration of wealth within the city's residential core. The municipal authorities utilized a specialized task force of clerks and assessors to inventory every building in the district, ensuring that the transfer of ownership was recorded in the city's land registries. This systematic confiscation was not limited to individual homes. It extended to the entire communal infrastructure, including the ritual bathhouses, the schools, and the expansive storage basements that had served as the nerve center for international trade. The primary objective of this liquidation was the Great Synagogue, the architectural and administrative heart of the community. Rather than destroying the structure, the municipal government and the local bishopric opted for its repurposing, viewing the building as a high-value physical asset that could be integrated into the city's religious landscape. By stripping the interior of its original ritual objects and converting the hall into a space for Christian worship or secular storage, the city authorities symbolically erased the community's presence while retaining the material benefits of their labor. The surrounding communal lands, including the ancient cemetery, were also seized. The headstones were often repurposed as building material for the expansion of the city's fortifications and public works, a practice that provided the municipal council with a source of pre-cut stone for ongoing infrastructure projects. Furthermore, the liquidation process targeted the community's intangible assets, specifically the remaining debt registries and physical collateral held against the local nobility. The city council asserted its right to collect on these outstanding obligations, effectively stepping into the role of the creditor, but without the legal constraints that had previously limited Jewish interest rates. This allowed the municipal treasury to extract wealth from the landed knights, further consolidating the town hall's power over the provincial aristocracy. The redistribution of these properties served as a reward for the Christian patricians who had supported the expulsion, as the most desirable stone houses were sold or granted to members of the city council. By the end of 1319, the Jewish quarter had been entirely absorbed into the municipal fabric of Breslau, its physical boundaries erased and its assets fully utilized to fund the city's transition into a self-governing, guild-dominated commune. The final Sabbath of the Jewish community in Breslau, occurring in the summer of 1319, represented the terminal phase of a century-long settlement as the residents reached the legal deadline for their mandatory departure. This period was defined by the transition from active commerce to the meticulous preparation of the communal archives and the protection of sacred objects. Within the stone residences of the University District, families worked to balance the demands of religious observance with the logistical necessity of organizing their remaining portable assets. The administrative leadership of the community utilized these final hours to verify marriage contracts, property titles, and genealogical records, ensuring that the legal identity of the Breslau rabbinate would survive the impending displacement. The atmosphere within the quarter was characterized by a systematic effort to secure the most vital cultural and intellectual property of the schools and libraries. Scholarly manuscripts and liturgical scrolls, which represented decades of rabbinic output, were prioritized for transport over physical wealth, as these documents were the only means of maintaining communal continuity in a new territory. Meanwhile, the physical boundaries of the district were monitored by municipal guards, who enforced a strict prohibition on the movement of bulk inventory out of the city gates. This created a forced stasis where the residents were surrounded by the immovable assets they were legally required to abandon, including the very furniture and architectural fittings of their homes. On this final day, the legal contract of 1264 was effectively extinguished in the minds of the residents, replaced by the immediate reality of statelessness. The community's judicial authorities issued final rulings on local civil disputes to ensure that no internal legal obligations remained unresolved before the crossing of the border. There was a concentrated effort to provide for the elderly and the infirm, organizing the logistics of transport for those unable to walk the distance toward the Polish frontier. The community's focus shifted entirely from the external world of the Breslau marketplace to the internal preservation of the group. By the conclusion of the Sabbath, the Jewish quarter had been transformed into a staging ground for a mass migration. The libraries were emptied of their parchment, the ritual spaces were deconsecrated by the removal of their central symbols, and the residents prepared to surrender the keys of their stone houses to the Municipal Commission. This final period of residence was not marked by chaos, but by a disciplined adherence to the protocols of a community that had historically relied on the written word and the rule of law to survive the collapse of secular protection. The physical departure of the Jewish community from Breslau in 1319 marked a significant demographic shift as the population moved eastward to seek asylum under the sovereignty of the Polish crown. This migration was a calculated response to the divergent political climates between the fragmented Silesian duchies and the consolidating Kingdom of Poland. While the municipal authorities in Breslau had successfully dismantled the local legal protections, King Casimir the Great was beginning to implement a centralized policy of economic revitalization that prioritized the integration of experienced financiers and merchants. The exodus was not a random flight, but a targeted relocation toward a state that viewed the Jewish merchant class as a vital component of its national reconstruction. The logistics of this journey required the community to navigate the border regions during a period of significant regional instability. The departing groups moved in organized caravans, carrying the essential communal records and portable assets that had been secured during the final days in the university district. This eastward movement followed the established trade routes that linked the Oder Basin with the Vistula, roads that the community had historically utilized for commerce, but which now served as a corridor for survival. The transition across the border into the Kingdom of Poland represented a formal change in legal status. The migrants moved from a jurisdiction of municipal hostility back into a system of royal protection, where the principles of the earlier charters were being reaffirmed and expanded. Upon reaching Polish territories, the Breslau exiles contributed to the rapid growth of urban centers like Krakow and Kazimierz. They brought with them specialized knowledge of international credit markets and the sophisticated administrative protocols of the Silesian rabbinate, which had been preserved in the manuscripts carried from the city. King Casimir utilized this influx of human capital to stabilize the Polish currency and expand the state's internal trade networks, granting the newcomers extensive privileges that mirrored the original statutes of the 13th century. This shift of resources effectively drained Breslau of its most experienced financial specialists, transferring the city's former commercial advantage to its eastern rivals. The exodus to the east ensured the continuity of the community's intellectual and economic traditions, albeit within a new political framework that favored royal centralism over municipal autonomy. By 1320, the former residents of Breslau had established the foundations of a new cultural center in Poland, leaving behind a city that had prioritized the immediate seizure of assets over the long-term benefits of an international merchant class. The final stage of the 1319 liquidation involved the systematic confiscation and desecration of the Jewish cemetery, an act that represented the total erasure of the community's historical presence in Breslau. This site, which had served as the burial ground for the Jewish population since the initial Piast invitations of the early 13th century, contained hundreds of headstones that chronicled the city's rabbinic and commercial lineage. Following the expulsion, the municipal authorities declared the cemetery to be abandoned property of the state. Unlike the residential buildings in the university district, which were repurposed for habitation, the cemetery was treated as a quarry for high-quality building materials. The local government recognized that the large, pre-cut slabs of sandstone and granite could be utilized to offset the rising costs of maintaining the city's defensive infrastructure. The removal of the headstones was an organized public works project managed by the Municipal Stonecutters Guild. These markers were systematically uprooted and transported to various construction sites along the city's perimeter. The most significant application of this material was the reinforcement of the city walls and the repair of the fortifications near the Oder River. Engineers positioned the gravestones with the Hebrew inscriptions facing inward or buried within the masonry, effectively embedding the community's genealogical record into the very physical barriers that now excluded them. This practice provided the city with an immediate supply of durable stone during a period of financial scarcity, allowing the council to strengthen the urban defenses without the expense of traditional quarrying and transport from distant Silesian hills. Furthermore, the repurposing of the cemetery land allowed for the expansion of the city's agricultural and residential zones. The municipal authorities divided the former burial grounds into smaller plots, which were sold to Christian burghers for use as orchards or garden spaces. This transformation of the landscape ensured that no physical trace of the Jewish sacred geography remained in the public sphere. The desecration also served a symbolic political purpose. It signaled the absolute finality of the expulsion. By utilizing the markers of the deceased as common paving stones or foundation blocks for public buildings, the City Council demonstrated that the Jewish community was no longer viewed as a distinct legal estate with a right to permanent memory. This act of material liquidation provided the municipal treasury with a tangible benefit while simultaneously completing the administrative process of cultural erasure. The stones of the Breslau Jewish community remained part of the city's architecture for centuries, hidden within the walls of a town that had formally decided to forget the architects of its early economic prosperity. The immediate aftermath of the 1319 expulsion was characterized by a catastrophic contraction of the Breslau economy, as the sudden removal of the Jewish community created a total void in the city's financial and administrative machinery. For over a century, the Jewish population had functioned as the primary engine of liquidity, providing the specialized credit necessary to bridge the gap between seasonal harvests and long-distance trade cycles. When this population was forcibly removed, the capital they managed did not simply transfer to Christian hands. Instead, the sophisticated networks of trust and expertise that supported that capital vanished overnight. The city faced an immediate credit crunch, where the lack of available silver and the absence of experienced lenders paralyzed the very marketplace the municipal guilds had sought to monopolize. The disappearance of Jewish expertise had a particularly devastating impact on the Duke's ability to manage state finances. Without the servants of the treasury to act as intermediaries, the sovereign was forced to rely on the merchant guilds for emergency funding. But these groups lacked the international liquid reserves and the willingness to lend under the same flexible conditions. The ducal mint also suffered a decline in quality and output, as the Jewish specialists who had previously overseen the purity and distribution of the coinage were no longer present to manage the logistics of precious metal acquisition. This led to a period of rapid currency devaluation across Silesia, which further discouraged foreign merchants from utilizing Breslau as a primary trading hub. The city's status as a gateway between the Baltic and the East began to erode, as trade caravans increasingly bypassed the Oder region in favor of the more stable markets developing in Poland under royal protection. Furthermore, the municipal authorities discovered that the seizure of physical assets, such as stone houses and synagogues, provided only a one-time fiscal gain that could not sustain the city's ongoing operational costs. While the city council had succeeded in canceling their own debts, they also destroyed the mechanism for future investment. The artisan guilds, which had lobbied for the removal of their Jewish competitors, found themselves unable to secure the raw materials needed for production because the international credit lines that funded bulk imports had been severed. The redistribution of Jewish property among the patrician class led to a period of internal corruption and litigation, as various factions within the Rat fought over the most lucrative spoils. By 1320, the economic reality in Breslau was one of stagnation. The city had achieved its goal of religious and social homogeneity, but at the cost of its financial relevance. The economic void left by the expulsion proved that the city's prosperity was not an inherent trait of its geography, but a direct result of the specialized minority it had systematically discarded. The aftermath of the 1319 expulsion saw the implementation of a systematic redistribution of Jewish assets, a process that functioned as the primary tool for the Breslau City Council to consolidate its domestic political authority. Following the departure of the community, the municipal government assumed total control over the vacant real estate in the university district, treating these high-value stone structures as a form of political currency. The council initiated a series of controlled auctions and direct grants, specifically targeting loyal Christian burghers and influential guild leaders who had been the most vocal proponents of the removal. This was not a random allocation of property, but a strategic effort to create a new class of property owners whose personal wealth was now directly tied to the permanence of the expulsion. To manage the legal transfer of these assets, the city's administrative clerks drafted new titles that formally erased the previous Jewish ownership records. This administrative scrubbing ensured that the new Christian occupants held their properties with clear municipal standing, bypassing any lingering claims from the ducal treasury. The redistribution of these houses allowed the city council to reward its political allies without depleting the municipal budget. By granting the most prestigious stone buildings to the heads of the merchant guilds, the Rat effectively secured a long-term alliance with the city's economic elite, ensuring that the municipal government remained the dominant power in Breslau. This process also served to physically integrate the former Jewish district into the surrounding urban fabric, as the new owners often modified the facades to match the architectural style of the Christian patrician class. Furthermore, the redistribution included the specialized equipment and inventories seized from Jewish workshops and warehouses. The tools of the money-changing trade, the heavy scales of the grain merchants, and the imported luxury goods found in storage were auctioned off to local Christian competitors at a fraction of their market value. This sudden influx of cheap capital allowed the Christian guilds to expand their operations into sectors where they had previously been unable to compete. The city council also utilized a portion of the liquidated wealth to fund public infrastructure projects, such as the renovation of the town hall and the repair of the main market square, providing a visible benefit of the expulsion to the general population. This era of redistribution proved that the removal of the Jewish community was as much about the internal reconfiguration of Christian power as it was about religious or social exclusion. By the end of 1320, the wealth of the Jewish quarter had been fully absorbed into the private estates of the burgher elite, creating a structural incentive to maintain the new exclusionary order of the city. The years following the 1319 expulsion saw the final administrative and architectural stabilization of the former Jewish quarter into a sanitized municipal district. This transformation was characterized by the systematic removal of the physical markers of the previous century's religious and cultural plurality. The municipal government implemented a strict policy of architectural conformity, encouraging the new Christian owners of the stone residences to renovate facades and remove any internal structural features, such as ritual alcoves or specific basement configurations, that had facilitated Jewish domestic and religious life. This process was not merely about aesthetics. It was a deliberate effort to erase the functional memory of the quarter, ensuring that the district operated entirely within the social and legal norms of the Christian burgher class. The demographic vacuum left by the exile of over 1,000 residents was rapidly filled by a wave of Germanic settlers and local Christian artisans. This population shift was managed by the city's guilds, which strictly enforced residency requirements that excluded non-Christians and non-citizens. The marketplace, once a site of complex intercommunal negotiation, became a space of total guild monopoly, where the prices and terms of credit were set by a small circle of patrician families. The absence of the Jewish merchant class led to a more insular economic environment, where the diversity of international connections was replaced by a focus on regional guild interests. The streets that had once hosted a vibrant rabbinic scholarship were now dominated by the activities of the Christian Mendicant orders, who utilized the former communal buildings for their own administrative and educational purposes. The transformation of the district also involved the renaming of thoroughfares and public spaces to align with the city's new religious identity. By replacing traditional names with those of Christian saints and local guild heroes, the city council finalized the legal and social absorption of the area. The silence of the streets during this period reflected the total absence of the legal and theological debates that had defined the city's early history. Breslau had achieved its goal of becoming a unified, self-governing Christian commune, but it did so by sacrificing its role as a bridge between the East and the West. The city's new infrastructure, built in part from the stones of the Jewish cemetery, served as a permanent monument to a policy of exclusion. By the mid-14th century, the former Jewish quarter was indistinguishable from the rest of the urban landscape, its history preserved only in the buried foundations of the stone houses and the hidden masonry of the city walls. This final chapter of the medieval city's evolution demonstrated the power of a municipal government to not only remove a population, but to fundamentally re-engineer the urban memory of its residents. The final stage of the 1319 expulsion was the systematic purge of Jewish names from the city's administrative and legal records, a process intended to finalize the community's removal from the public memory of Breslau. Following the physical departure of the residents and the auctioning of their properties, the municipal clerks began an extensive audit of the city's tax rolls and citizenship lists. This was not a passive update, but a deliberate effort to erase the documentary evidence of the Jewish estate's former status as a protected legal entity. By striking these names from the official ledgers, the city council transformed the former residents into administrative ghosts, effectively nullifying any future legal claims to property, debts, or residency rights. This bureaucratic erasure extended to the archives of the ducal treasury, where the records of the servants of the treasury were archived as closed files. The detailed accounts of Jewish tax contributions, which had once documented the community's vital role in funding the Piast dynasty, were largely discarded or summarized in a way that omitted specific family names and commercial histories. In the municipal court records, the outcomes of century-old litigations were re-indexed to prioritize the Christian litigants, often omitting the Jewish defendants or plaintiffs entirely. This process of archival scrubbing ensured that the new Christian owners of the stone houses in the University District held titles that appeared to have no prior history of Jewish tenure. The goal was to create a legal blank slate that would prevent any future duke or external authority from reinstating the old charters based on the historical precedent. Furthermore, the City Council directed the municipal chroniclers to revise the narrative of the city's early economic growth. The contributions of Jewish financiers to the construction of the market square and the stabilization of the currency were minimized or attributed to the collective efforts of the burgher estate. This administrative silence was reinforced by the destruction of hundreds of Hebrew contracts and marriage deeds that had been seized during the liquidation of the communal libraries. These documents, which provided the only granular record of the community's social and internal legal life, were treated as waste parchment or used as reinforcement for the bindings of new municipal ledgers. By the mid-14th century, the administrative identity of the Jewish community had been successfully liquidated. The names that had once defined the city's international commerce were gone from the official rolls, by leaving a sanitized historical record that presented Breslau as a purely Christian municipality since its inception. This act of bureaucratic erasure completed the expulsion, ensuring that the community was not only physically gone, but legally and historically invisible. The expulsion of 1319 functioned as more than a localized event. It established a definitive administrative and legal blueprint that other Silesian principalities and emerging municipal powers would adopt throughout the 14th century. By successfully navigating the complexities of removing a protected estate without triggering a total economic collapse or a royal intervention, the Breslau City Council demonstrated that the traditional ducal monopoly on Jewish jurisdiction could be broken. This precedent proved that a coordinated effort between the municipal government, the local clergy, and an insolvent sovereign could effectively nullify the ancient charters of the 13th century. The methods pioneered in Breslau, specifically the systematic auditing of debts, the repurposing of communal stone architecture, and the rebranding of confiscated assets as municipal property, became the standard operational procedure for the removal of Jewish communities across Central Europe. This era marked the definitive end of the first great period of Jewish Breslau, a phase characterized by the high-level integration of the community into the state's fiscal and international trade networks. The collapse of the 1264 legal framework signaled a permanent shift in the status of the Jewish resident from a protected servant of the treasury to a temporary guest whose residency was contingent upon the immediate needs of the local burghers. While Jewish individuals would eventually return to the city in later centuries, they would never again enjoy the same degree of institutional autonomy or the direct, high-level protection of a sovereign duke. The 1319 expulsion effectively decapitated the intellectual and financial leadership of the Silesian rabbinate, shifting the center of gravity for Jewish scholarship and commerce permanently toward the east. Historically, the events of 1319 served as a litmus test for the rising power of the urban commune against the fading influence of the feudal monarchy. The successful liquidation of Jewish assets provided the city council with the necessary capital to finance its own civic expansion, proving that the removal of a minority could be a profitable state enterprise. This lesson was not lost on neighboring cities like Liegnitz or Schweidnitz, which soon initiated their own restrictive measures modeled on the Breslau ordinances. The legacy of 1319 was the creation of a new, exclusionary municipal identity that prioritized religious and social uniformity over the benefits of international pluralism. The first era of Jewish Breslau ended not with a sudden catastrophe, but with a cold, administrative victory for the municipal state, leaving behind a city that had fundamentally redefined its relationship with the laws of its founders. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.